Welcome back. In part one of this video, I showed you how to cut the mortise and tenons for the shelf. If you haven't watched that, go back and take a look. Now in part two, I'm going to show you how to cut the dovetails for the top, how to put the whole thing together, and how to add some finishing touches.
The first step for dovetails is to cut the tails on the sides. This is basically the same as cutting the tenons with one small change. To start, we're going to do the same thing and mark the depth. Again, similarly with the tenons, it doesn't really hurt to have it a little extra, but I find that if I just set my gauge off the thickness of one of my boards, it works just fine. Next, you'll mark out where you're gonna cut the tails. This doesn't really need to be super precise. I did about 3 inches in from each side to give me about a 5-inch tail. Now you're gonna be cutting in towards the middle of the board. I just sketched that on there with a pencil, and I always like to mark what I'm gonna cut off so I don't accidentally cut the wrong part off. This jig has a side to help you cut the slope at exactly a 1 to 6 angle. If you don't have the jig though, don't freak out about it. You can draw a triangle that has sides of 1 and 6 inches, say, and set a bevel gauge to draw it on your board if you want. But actually, the exact angle really doesn't matter much at all. The important part here is just that your saw is perpendicular to the board. That means that your saw and the board, it makes a 90-degree angle. The slope doesn't really matter. So if you're freehanding it, just set it up like you were cutting the tenon and then tilt your saw a tiny bit towards the outside of the board. Then, just like the tenon, you just have to cut off the sides. And the same principle here applies. You can either try to cut it really well, or you can cut to the outside and then go to your knife line with a chisel. Do that 3 more times and you'll have all your tails cut. Now we're gonna take those tails and transfer the marks to the top and bottom boards to make corresponding pins. It's simple in theory, but it can be a bit awkward. I like to put the pin board on my vise and line it up perfectly, well, close with my plane, but you could also use a scrap of wood or something like that there as well. Then I lay the tail board on top of that to make the marks. The other thing here, you do need to keep track of which board goes with which and in which direction. I like to put corresponding letters on the outside of each board so I don't get confused about which board goes with which and in which direction, and then you can just sand the marks off later. If I was freehanding this, I'd be making these marks with a knife, but with this jig, I just throw some pencil marks on there to make sure I don't get confused about which direction to cut in. You can see I actually hold the board up as a sanity check to make sure I did this right. Now again, you wanna make sure you cut on the waist side. And the other part here is now we're cutting an angle to match the tails. When you cut the tails, it wasn't important what angle you chose, but now it is because you wanna match that angle. So you wanna make this cut as precise as you can. Is a little more tricky than getting it off of the sides with the tails. I'm gonna use a fret saw here, but you could also use a coping saw or just a chisel. I'll link to some videos below on how to do those. With any of these methods, the trick though is just getting the bulk out, but staying away from that line. And then we're gonna come back with the chisel and pare to that line. Chiseling to that line is basically the same principle as with the mortises. You want to go halfway in from each side and meet in the middle. The really only added difficulty here is those angled cuts for the tails mean you have to try to kind of look down at your chisel and follow that angle so that you don't blow through the angled cuts that you made. If you do end up blowing off a big piece, you can always use a little wood glue and painter's tape to put it back on. I thought it might be hard to sand the inside once it's together, so I sanded it all before assembly. I recommend staying away from your tenons though, since you don't want to make them smaller than your mortises. Also be careful not to sand off those pencil marks you need for the dovetails. My sander catches about 1/3 of the dust it creates, so I always do my sanding outside even if it's really cold. A nice detail you could add would be to chamfer the corners. I do this with a hand plane because I have it, but you could also do it with some sandpaper. If you're being picky, there are a few spots you're not gonna wanna chamfer. The inside of the sides that meet the shelves, you don't wanna do those. And the inside of the top and bottom pins that are gonna flush up against the tailboard, you also don't wanna do those really. Probably the simplest and best looking compromise here is gonna be to just skip the insides edges of the sides and the insides of the top and bottom altogether. That way you won't hit those spots that you don't wanna do. Now it's time to put this beast together. I started with the shelves dry fit in the order that I wanted them, so I didn't get that confused. Then I just pulled them out, add glue to each piece, and put them back in. I really don't know the best trick to avoiding glue squeeze out, and it's honestly pretty hard to clean in those little cracks. And the issue with that is that finish doesn't like to stick to glue, and so if you have a lot of glue on there, you're probably gonna see it. I think the best thing to do if you do want to take the time to make this really nice is to put painter's tape around the outside so that any glue squeeze out goes on the tape rather than on your wood. Once I got it all in on the one side, I lifted the whole thing up onto the sawhorses, put glue on all of the other sides, and then the other side should just slide on to those tenons and into those pins. My boards, top and bottom boards, are pretty cupped, so I tried to straighten them out with some flat pieces of wood and some clamps here, and I do think it helped a little bit. Then I added some flat pieces onto the top and bottom so that when I wrap this ratchet strap around, it's hopefully pulling the top and bottom pieces together. Next, I put the clamps on right by the shelves, and as I tighten those, I could really see the gaps between the shelves and the sides closing. Ideally, you'd probably have 6 here. I did 5, and I think it worked out pretty well. Now, unfortunately for me, I'm just realizing that I probably should have made sure that this was square. So I tried measuring with my tape measure, but there was so much crap in the way that it was really hard to see. Then I got a big builder square and tried to measure from the outside, and there was so much crap in the way that was hard to do, and I didn't want to take all the clamps off because the glue was starting to set. So finally I realized what I could do was take a small speed square and check for square on the inside. And lucky for me, it was basically pretty close, and close enough for me that I just left it. Although when you're doing it, I would recommend checking that it's square before you tighten all of your clamps. I recommend leaving that for a full 24 hours. I've never done less, but that's what the bottle says, so that's what I do. Now remember, we left those shelves and the top and bottom proud. I did like a full 1/4 inch, so those things are sticking out pretty good there. So I'm just gonna come in with my Ryoba saw and flush cut that all off. These saws don't have any set, so you can use them as a flush cut saw without scratching up your side. But if the side's not perfectly flat, sometimes you'll find that the saw starts to dig in a little bit. So just kind of watch what you're doing. Don't just mindlessly saw, and if it starts to dig in, stop and reset. And you should be good.
All right, so this thing has turned out rock solid. Even though, aesthetically, take a look at the joints. Some of them are better than others, but they're holding really, really strong. Now, I'm not gonna do these next 2 tricks, I'll tell you, because it's gonna be in a closet. These are gonna be up against the wall. and I have a baby on the way, so I have better things to do. But even this joint right here, where there are some big gaps, right on the sides, and there's a lot of chip out on the top, you can take care of this with two easy things. First, take a piece of scrap wood, cut off a wedge, and put a little glue on that, and just drive that wedge into the edge here. Let it dry, flush cut it off, and you'll be amazed the type of gaps you can fill up by doing that. I did that on a lot of my record player stand, and I have to crouch down, get right up there and look at it to even tell we're ready. The second thing you can do is, even though my orbital sander only collects about a third of the sawdust, that was more than enough for this next trick. Take some of your sawdust, mix it up with some regular wood glue, paste it all on there, put that, just kind of cover it all up. It's gonna be really thick and blotchy and look bad. Let it harden and just sand it off. Sand it nice and smooth, and those little gaps around the top are gonna be filled in. Yeah, it's gonna look, you'll be surprised at how good it actually looks.
A flush cut saw will get you close, but a final sanding is really gonna take it up a notch. I also use the orbital sander to round off the top and bottom edges while I'm out there. It's not really the best tool for that job. Probably a sanding block and just your hand is gonna work better, but it did get the job done for me. If it were hardwood, I might round it off with a hand plane, but planing end grain on pine without chipping off huge chunks requires sharper tools than I have.